My name is Arthur Matthews. I was 74 that winter, a retired accountant from the county hospital in Brunswick, Maine. That December was the first in 47 years that I decorated the house alone. I moved slowly now. My knees stiffened more each year, but I still climbed the small stepladder to hang the golden lights across the porch. I untangled the cords in the freezing air, my breath visible with each sigh. The lights were the ones Mary had chosen over 20 years ago. She always insisted on warm white, not the flashing multicolor ones you saw in stores. She said they looked tired and trying too hard. I hung the same garland around the banister and set up the wooden reindeer she had found at a craft fair in 1993. One had lost an antler. I glued it back on with shaking hands. I put on the old record player and played the album she loved, Andy Williams singing about chestnuts and sleigh rides, and let it crackle through the rooms that no longer echoed with her steps. The kitchen smelled of rosemary, garlic, and butter. I was making her recipe. The roast needed to be seared exactly 9 minutes on each side. The potatoes had to be mashed with cream, not milk, and the pecan pie had to cool on the windowsill, like she always did, where the wind could carry its scent out toward the woods. I laid out the table settings: 3 plates, 3 cloth napkins folded the way she taught me, 3 forks, 3 glasses. Her seat was at the head of the table by the fireplace. I left it untouched. It felt wrong to clear it away, so I simply let it be. The flame flickered behind the glass, soft and low, casting shadows on the polished mahogany. I polished that table until my wrists ached. It gleamed like it did when we first bought it. She always said it was too big for our tiny dining room, but I liked how solid it felt under my arms, like permanence. I dressed in my dark green sweater and the brown slacks she had given me 5 Christmases ago. They were a bit loose now, but I tucked the waistband in. I combed my hair and used a touch of aftershave even though I wasn't going anywhere. The house had to feel like Christmas, not for guests, for memory. By 5 o'clock, the sky outside had already turned the color of ash. Snow began to fall gently, covering the porch rail, the yard, the bird bath she used to fill with cranberries. I lit the candles on the windowsills and turned off the ceiling lights. The house looked like a postcard, exactly the way she loved it. I stood there for a while, staring at the tree we had bought together. I'd driven to the lot alone that year and picked a Fraser fir as close in size and shape as I could remember. I trimmed it myself, hands shaking as I tied on each ornament from our decades together. Tiny wooden angels, the glass bell from our first year, a crocheted Santa made by her mother. Even the clumsy felt heart David had made in the 3rd grade, still slightly crooked. I hung it front and center. I checked my watch at least 6 times. They said they'd be by at 6, maybe 6:30. I didn't want to look eager, but I kept straightening things. I adjusted the napkins again. I reheated the gravy. I turned the music down, then back up again. I lit a fire in the hearth and made sure the room was warm. By 6:40, I opened the curtains to see if headlights were coming down the road. At 7, I turned the oven to low, to keep everything warm. I sat by the window, the one where Mary used to press her hand to the glass whenever someone she loved pulled into the driveway. I kept looking out, blinking against the reflection of lights behind me. Snow kept falling. The street was quiet. At 8, the doorbell rang. I rose too quickly and nearly stumbled. I opened the door with a smile already on my face. But it wasn't David. It wasn't Melissa. It was a young man with a clipboard and a delivery box wrapped in green paper. He handed me a small envelope. "Merry Christmas, sir," he said, then walked back to the idling van. I stared at the envelope for a long moment. The handwriting was David's. I sat down in my armchair, the one Mary had embroidered with blue thread along the armrest. I opened the envelope slowly. There was a folded sheet inside. No card, no letter, just one line. "Hope you enjoy the quiet. We figured you'd want to rest. Love, D&M." That was it. There was no mention of dinner, no mention of the place I'd set for them, no explanation. I looked back at the tree. The lights blinked lazily. The ornament swayed slightly from the draft under the door. The roast had grown cold. I sat there until well after midnight, in the room that used to be full. The candles had burned down. The fire had dimmed to orange coals. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just sat still. The tree sparkled on, and I waited for nothing. I placed the envelope on the table and stared at it as if it might change. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the kind that usually carries a formal invitation or an old-fashioned letter. But it had no weight to it. I held it between my fingers, flipped it back and forth, hoping I had missed something. A second page, a small note tucked deep inside. But there was nothing. Only that single line, scribbled in black ink. Hope you enjoy the quiet. We figured you'd want to rest. Love, D&M. I read it again, as if repetition would make it kinder. It didn't. I turned it over again and noticed a tiny stain on the back. Gravy? Coffee? A thumbprint, perhaps. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it wasn't a card. It wasn't a message. It wasn't even a lie to soften the truth. It was laziness wrapped in a joke, or maybe cruelty wrapped in laziness. I couldn't tell anymore. The envelope sat between the roasted meat and the mashed potatoes, its blank face catching the warm light of the candles that still flickered. It felt obscene, that paper, resting like a centerpiece among dishes meant to be shared. I wanted to fold it in half, to crush it in my fist, to throw it into the fire behind me. But I didn't move. Instead, I stood and walked slowly to the kitchen. The roast was cold now, the fat congealed around the edges. The potatoes had stiffened into peaks, and the pie, untouched on the sill, looked too perfect to eat. I rinsed my hands under warm water, not because they were dirty, but because I needed to feel something other than disappointment. The water ran over my knuckles, thin and ghost-like. My reflection in the faucet was warped, my features stretched and curved. I looked older than I felt. Or maybe I felt older than I looked. I dried my hands with the towel Mary had embroidered with little snowflakes and returned to the dining room. I picked up the envelope again. It was still light, still empty. I brought it to my study, the room at the back of the house where I kept my desk, my books, the old typewriter she had given me when I retired. I sat at the desk and turned on the lamp. The bulb flickered for a second before steadying into a dull glow. I laid the envelope on the blotter and just looked at it. The fireplace in the front room crackled softly, the only sound in the house. I thought of David at Melissa's parents' house, probably passing around presents, clinking glasses, laughing. I imagined her mother handing him a second helping of something, her father pouring wine, their dog begging under the table. All of it easy, warm, bright, and none of it here. My hands moved on their own. I opened the drawer where I kept old stationery. Mary had loved paper, real paper, with texture and weight. I pulled out one of the folded sheets and reached for a pen. I didn't write anything. I just sat with the pen in hand, thinking about how many words I had swallowed in the past few months, how many times I had smiled through silence. Then I did something strange. I slipped the blank sheet into the envelope. It fit perfectly. I folded the flap over and pressed it shut. Now it wasn't empty anymore. It held something. Not a message, not yet. But space. Potential. Maybe that was what I needed. Space. A place to put what I couldn't yet say. I walked to the fireplace with the envelope in hand and stood there for a while. The fire had died to low embers, but the heat still radiated. I didn't throw it in. I placed it gently on the mantel beside a small framed photo of Mary at the lake. She was laughing, her hair windblown, a paper plate in her lap with a dripping slice of watermelon. I stared at the image for a long time. I hadn't remembered taking that photo, but there it was, proof of joy, of simplicity, of a time before my world narrowed. That night I didn't sleep well. I tossed under the quilt, the silence now feeling too wide, the corners of the room too sharp. I got up twice to check if the porch light was off, if the back door was locked, if the envelope was still where I left it. Each time, it was. Each time, it stared back at me with the same blank indifference. In the morning, I found snow had piled on the steps. I didn't shovel it. I left it to melt, to do what snow does. I reheated some of the potatoes, not because I was hungry, but because I couldn't bear to throw them away. I poured myself coffee, sat at the table, and looked again at the empty place across from me. Mary's chair. I imagined her reaction to the envelope. She would have laughed, not out of amusement, but in that dry way she used when she was deeply, silently offended. The kind of laugh that said more than words ever could. Then she would have looked at me, handed me the envelope, and said, "What do you want to do with this?" That question stayed with me. What did I want to do with this? I didn't know yet, but I had a strange sense that the envelope was not finished, that it wasn't the end of a gesture, but the beginning of something else, something not yet shaped, and I too wasn't finished. I wasn't ready to become a man remembered only at holidays. I wasn't ready to sit quietly while others wrote the ending. So I folded the napkins. I cleaned the plates. I placed the envelope into the drawer beside the photo albums. It would not go in the trash. It would stay. It would become something. But not yet. The days after Christmas passed like mist, formless, quiet, and slow. I moved through the house like I was underwater, each step heavier than the last. I didn't play music. I didn't turn on the television. The house existed in stillness, and so did I. There was no laughter, no voices, no footsteps echoing off the hardwood floor. Only the creak of the old wood, the tick of the clock in the hallway, and the occasional hiss of the heater kicking in. I woke each morning without an alarm. There was no reason to set one. I brewed coffee mechanically, measuring the grounds by habit, pouring the water by feel. I sat at the kitchen table in my robe, watching the steam rise from the mug and curl into the air, like smoke from an invisible fire. The only sound was the spoon clinking against the side of the cup. That, and the groan of the refrigerator. I used to curse that sound, said I'd replace the damn thing. Now I was grateful for it. It reminded me I wasn't deaf, just alone. The tree still stood in the corner of the living room. I hadn't taken it down. I wasn't ready. The lights were off now, but the ornaments still hung there, dull in the gray winter light. I walked past it each day and touched one or two pieces as I passed. The felt heart, the crocheted angel, the paper snowflake David made when he was 7. One corner of it was torn. I used to think I'd fix it someday. Now I wasn't sure I wanted to. It was his fingerprint in time. Flawed, innocent, real. The days bled into each other. I stopped checking the date. The calendar in the kitchen still read December. I hadn't turned the page. January could wait. I had nowhere to be. No one was waiting for me. I sat in the armchair by the front window, sometimes for hours. I watched the mailman come and go. I watched the neighbor's dog run through the snow. I watched the light shift across the walls as the day passed. And at night, I turned on one lamp and sat in silence until it was time to sleep again. At first I tried to call David. I left a message. Nothing heavy. Just a simple, "Hope you two had a good time. Give me a ring." He didn't. Then I tried again the next day. Nothing. On the third day, I didn't call. I told myself I was giving him space. But I knew the truth. I didn't want to hear silence on the other end. That kind of quiet is worse than any noise. I cleaned the house slowly. I washed the table linens and folded them just the way Mary used to. I vacuumed under the rug in the hallway, even though no one would see it. I dusted the bookshelf, rearranging the spines so the tallest were on the edges. Mary liked it that way. She said it made the room feel more grounded. At night, I climbed into bed alone. Her side was still made, still untouched. I hadn't moved her pillow. I hadn't disturbed the indentation where her head used to rest. The sheets smelled faintly of lavender. I buried my face in them once, foolishly hoping to catch a trace of her perfume. I didn't. It had faded months ago. All that remained was the memory of scent. I started walking around the block in the afternoons. Just once, slowly, bundled in my thick coat and scarf. The cold air bit at my cheeks and made my eyes water. The houses were all lit from within, families sitting at tables, kids watching television, a couple dancing in their kitchen. I passed them like a ghost. I waved once or twice, but no one looked up. I didn't blame them. I barely recognized myself in the frosted windows. The house didn't complain. It didn't ask anything of me. But I felt it watching. The silence wasn't neutral. It was thick, full of unsaid things. The hallway held memories like cobwebs. The stairs remembered the weight of two people, not one. The pantry still had her labeled jars. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. Even the labels were in her handwriting. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, her Christmas trio. One night, the wind picked up. I heard it whistling through the trees in the backyard, rattling the windows like fingers tapping to be let in. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and sighs of the house. It wasn't haunted, not in the usual way. But it remembered. Every room held a shadow, every drawer a relic. I opened one in the guest room and found a box of old holiday cards, each one signed in her looping script. Some from David's school years, others from neighbors who'd since moved away. I sat on the floor and read them all, one by one, my legs going numb beneath me. I didn't cry. I hadn't. Not really. Not since the funeral. The tears came in short waves, little betrayals of the eyes that dried before they reached my cheeks. But there, in the quiet, I felt the weight press deeper. Not grief exactly, not loneliness, something slower, a kind of erosion. I started talking aloud sometimes just to hear my own voice. "That's too much salt," I said once while cooking. "We need more milk," I muttered, opening the fridge. I pretended she was answering. I imagined her voice in the corners of the room, soft, amused, tired. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. Some things aren't meant for sharing. The house without sound didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a waiting room, and I didn't know what I was waiting for. But I kept waking up. I kept making coffee. I kept walking the block. And every night, before turning out the light, I'd glance at the drawer where I kept the envelope. Still there. Still waiting. The morning began, like most others, gray light filtering through the blinds, the quiet hum of the radiator kicking on, the faint creak of the house stretching itself awake. I brewed coffee without thinking, poured it into the same chipped mug I had used all week, and sat at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around the warmth. I stared at the steam rising, trying to gather the will to do something different, anything outside the cycle I had built since Christmas. And for some reason that morning, I stood up and walked to the hallway closet. It had been a long time since I opened that closet. It wasn't the kind of space that held things you needed daily. It was the kind of place where old coats went to die, where dusty boxes waited out the years without complaint. I pulled on the handle and winced at the groan of the hinges. The scent of mothballs and aged fabric greeted me like a relic from another life. I reached for a stack of boxes on the top shelf, dragging them down one by one until I found what I hadn't realized I was looking for. It was a large banker's box, heavy and dull brown, its corners softened by time. On the lid, in Mary's careful handwriting, were the words, "Taxes, deeds, letters." I carried it to the dining table like it held something fragile, even though I knew it was only paper. But somehow, Paper had become one of the few things that felt real in my life. Paper didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It aged honestly. I opened the lid and was immediately met with layers of envelopes, manila folders, and yellowed receipts. I inhaled the scent of time, ink, paper, and dust. Each layer I peeled back felt like uncovering a fossil record of our life together. Bills from the 1980s, warranties from appliances we no longer owned, greeting cards from anniversaries long past. I sorted through them slowly, careful not to bend or tear anything, as if damaging them would somehow damage the memories they carried. Halfway through the box, I found the folder labeled House. Inside were copies of the mortgage documents, the deed, insurance papers, and a few photos we had taken the day we bought the place. One of them showed Mary standing on the porch, her hair caught in the wind, a proud smile on her face. I traced the edges of the photo with my finger, remembering how young we were, how sure we had been of everything. There was a confidence in her eyes I hadn't seen in anyone for years. Beneath that folder was another, labeled Personal. I opened it and found a collection of letters, some typed, some handwritten. Most were from Mary. She had kept every letter I had written her while I was on work trips, even the ones where I had only said I missed her and talked about the weather. I had forgotten I used to write like that. I had forgotten I ever bothered. There was one letter, in particular, that stopped me. It was in a different envelope, not sealed, but heavier than the others. I opened it carefully and unfolded the pages. It wasn't from me, it was from her, dated 3 years ago. The handwriting was hers, but more deliberate, slower. She must have known she was getting sick. In it, she spoke of the house, of her fears of being forgotten, and of her hope that I would find peace in solitude. She mentioned a second account, one in my name alone, and instructions for where to find the key to a small lockbox. She said she didn't want David or anyone else to know about it yet. "They wouldn't understand," she wrote, "and this is for you." My hands trembled slightly as I read it, not from shock, but from the sudden, overwhelming sense that she was still here, not in the photos or the ornaments or even the sheets on the bed, but in this letter, in her choices, in her thoughtfulness. She had planned for my aloneness in a way I hadn't allowed myself to consider. I reread the letter 3 times. I folded it neatly and returned it to its envelope, then placed it in the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. I wasn't ready to look for the lockbox, not yet, but just knowing it existed had changed the room around me. The silence wasn't as sharp. The house felt less hollow. I returned to the box and continued sorting. At the bottom was a small bundle of photos held together with a rubber band that had long since hardened and snapped as I touched it. The photos spilled out across the table. Family gatherings, beach vacations, blurry shots of birthday cakes. One picture of David as a boy, sitting on my shoulders, his tiny hands holding tufts of my hair. His grin was wide, his cheeks sunburnt. I stared at it for a long time. That boy had grown into a man I barely recognized, a man who had sent an empty envelope as a joke. I put the photo aside and gathered the papers back into the box, leaving out the few I couldn't yet put away. The letter, the photo of Mary on the porch, the one of David on my shoulders. I placed them on the desk in my study, arranging them like anchors. The day passed without me noticing. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't changed clothes. I sat in the study until the sun dipped below the trees, the room dimming to a pale blue. I turned on the desk lamp, the same one Mary used to read by. Its warm glow spilled over the papers like a quiet conversation. That night, I didn't sleep in the bedroom. I stayed in the study, curled in the armchair with a quilt over my legs, the letter in my pocket. I didn't know what tomorrow would ask of me, but I felt for the first time in a while that I had something to hold on to, a thread, a whisper, a plan not yet revealed, but waiting. In the morning, I would find the key, but for now, I let the quiet sit with me, not as punishment, but as memory, and in that stillness, I felt less alone. I woke up with the kind of clarity that only arrives after weeks of noise and fog. There was no real trigger, no dramatic moment, no thunderclap of revelation. Just a soft certainty, like a door clicking shut behind you. I had to see the account for myself, the one Mary mentioned in her letter, the one she created without telling anyone but me. The morning was quiet. Cold light pressed against the window panes, turning the frost into tiny crystals. I sat with my coffee again, but this time, my eyes weren't glazed over. They scanned the list I had started building in my mind since the night before. Her words had not just lingered, they had moved something in me. I didn't want to go back to sleepwalking through the house. I wanted to know. I needed to see what she left for me, what she trusted me with. After breakfast, I went into the small drawer in her old writing desk. It was the kind of drawer that always stuck halfway, the wood swollen slightly from decades of humidity. I had never opened it before without her asking me to, but now I knew what I was looking for. Underneath an envelope of old stamps and a few dried lavender sprigs wrapped in wax paper, I found it. A tiny brass key on a faded red ribbon. It didn't look like much, but my hands knew it mattered. The lockbox wasn't hidden. It was on the top shelf of the linen closet, right where she had always kept the winter sheets and extra candles. I pulled it down carefully, dust rising in soft clouds around it. The box was old, but solid, heavy, like it had been holding its breath. When I turned the key, the lock clicked open with a soft metallic sigh. Inside were folders, neatly labeled. Each had my name on it. Not us, not joint, not family. Just me. That was the part that hit the hardest. Her handwriting had changed over the years, rounder, a little shakier, but it was unmistakably hers. One folder read, Bank Statements, Richard. Another, IRA, Richard Blake. And then the third, simply, Letters and Final Wishes. I started with the statements. I laid them out on the dining room table, arranging them in order like the pieces of a quiet puzzle. The numbers were exact, the balances healthy. It wasn't millions, but it was more than I had expected. Over the years, she had saved quietly, funneling a portion of her teaching salary into this account. I saw her name listed once on an early deposit slip, then never again. The rest was mine. Only mine. There were CDs set to renew annually, modest investments, even a safe deposit box noted with the branch and key number. It was meticulous, structured. She had thought through every detail. I remembered the way she used to sit at the kitchen table with her reading glasses sliding down her nose, pen tapping on a calculator. I thought she was just balancing groceries and utility bills. I didn't know she was building a second future. One for me, in case the rest failed. As I read further, I saw her notations in the margins. For house upkeep, if you stay. Enough for rent for 2 years, if you leave. Travel, if you finally go see Italy. Each comment was a whisper of who she knew me to be. She had left no instructions, only options. She trusted I would know what to do. The letter in the Final Wishes folder was short. She told me not to feel guilty for anything. Not for being angry. Not for being relieved. Not for wanting to leave everything behind. She said I had earned the right to choose. She even mentioned the possibility that David might try to claim what wasn't his, and that the legal work had already been done to prevent that. Her lawyer's name was listed, along with a sealed envelope marked, "For Mr. Carmichael only." She had been thinking so far ahead, while I had barely been able to imagine her gone. I didn't know how to sit with that knowledge. I walked around the house slowly, the papers still in my hand, as if the walls would absorb the news and tell me what to feel. But they remained quiet. The photos on the mantel didn't shift. The clock ticked without commentary. The heater kicked on again. I sat back down and looked at the numbers once more. There were accounts I didn't recognize, names of funds I never paid attention to. But it was all there, in black and white, with my name at the top. Not mine and hers, just mine. I hadn't had something that belonged solely to me in years. Decades, maybe. At first, the guilt crept in, the kind that says, "Why didn't you know? Why weren't you paying attention?" But that guilt was quickly overtaken by something calmer. Gratitude. Not the kind you say out loud at Thanksgiving. A quieter, more painful kind. The kind that forms in your chest and expands slowly, pressing against your ribs with the weight of everything left unsaid. I thought of all the times I brushed off her budgeting habits, the envelopes she kept in the kitchen drawer marked emergency or winter gas. I had chalked it up to her nature. A teacher's discipline, I used to say. But now I saw it clearly. She had been building a safety net long before either of us knew we'd need it. I pulled out a notebook and started writing. Names of banks, phone numbers, a checklist of things to confirm. I wasn't rushing. I didn't feel panicked. But for the first time since the funeral, I had purpose. Not obligation, not ritual. Purpose. That night, I spread all the documents across the living room floor and sat with them like a man taking inventory of a life he didn't know he had. Each piece of paper was a revelation, not because of the money, but because of what it meant. She hadn't trusted the world to take care of me, so she did it herself, quietly, precisely, completely. As the fire in the hearth burned low, I found myself whispering her name, not to summon her, not to mourn her, just to say it. Because now, more than ever, I understood how much she had seen, how deeply she had known me, and how far ahead she had looked, even when I was too blind to notice. The bank was quiet in a way that reminded me of hospitals, not just the hush of carpeted floors and the gentle click of doors closing behind frosted glass, but the deeper, artificial stillness. The kind that made you hyper-aware of your own breathing. It had been years since I had stepped inside this branch, though it was only a few miles from the house. I had passed it dozens of times on the way to the grocery store, always thinking of it as a place for other people. Young couples opening joint accounts, small business owners applying for loans. I never imagined I'd be walking in with a key and an envelope marked for Mr. Carmichael only. That morning, I woke before the sun. I brewed my coffee and sat in the kitchen, watching the red digits on the microwave count forward toward the opening hour. I had everything laid out. The lockbox key, Mary's notes, the documents she left behind. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I thought there might be nerves, or worse, doubt, but what I felt was clean, sharp, the kind of clarity that follows a long confusion. I arrived early, too early. The glass doors were still locked, and the parking lot was empty, but for a single maintenance truck with its hazard lights blinking. I waited in my car, engine off, watching as the branch manager arrived, then the tellers, one by one. I recognized none of them. Everyone I had known in this building had retired, moved on, or passed. That made it easier, in a way. I wasn't here for conversation or familiarity. I was here for truth. When the doors unlocked, I stepped inside. The warmth was immediate, forced air pumping through the vents, carrying with it the dry scent of carpet cleaner and printer toner. Holiday garlands hung along the counters, faded red and green, a little lopsided. I nodded at the greeter and walked toward the reception desk, envelope in hand. I waited while the young woman behind the counter flipped through a laminated binder. Her name tag read Kendra. She smiled with the kind of professionalism that made me feel like a relic. I handed her the envelope. Her smile faltered just a little as she read the name on the front. Mr. Carmichael only, it said, handwritten in Mary's looping script. She disappeared behind the frosted glass without another word. I stood still. I didn't fidget. I didn't shift my weight. The envelope was already doing the talking. I watched my reflection in the polished floor tiles, gray hair, black coat, posture slightly tilted from years of standing in courtrooms. I had spent my life as a municipal clerk, balancing statutes and deadlines, organizing files with precision. But here, I felt like an intruder in someone else's narrative. When Mr. Carmichael finally emerged, he looked exactly as I had expected. Dark suit, silver tie, a calm, deliberate walk. He extended his hand and introduced himself, then gestured for me to follow him into his office. I noticed that the holiday cheer didn't reach this part of the building. No garlands, no fake snow on the windows, just order and silence. He closed the door behind me, asked me to sit, and opened the envelope with the same care one might use to unseal a will. His eyes scanned the letter slowly. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a folder. My name was on it. Not in Mary's handwriting. This was bank standard, typed and tabbed. It felt clinical, real. He confirmed my identity, double-checked a few documents I had brought. Driver's license, the death certificate, the original notarized letter Mary had included. Then he opened the folder. Inside were a series of account summaries. One by one he laid them out in front of me. My eyes flicked across them. Dates, amounts, allocations, numbers so large and so deliberate they didn't feel real. She had moved the bulk of our savings, hers really, into a private trust. My name was the only one on it. The trust had been constructed 5 years earlier. I had no idea, not a clue. There were stipulations. Withdrawals could be made at my discretion. Funds could not be reassigned or transferred without my notarized approval. In the event of my death, the beneficiary was not our son. The line read, "To be determined by Richard Blake upon request, or by sealed letter provided to the estate attorney." I stared at that line for a long time. Mr. Carmichael said nothing. He simply handed me a pen and a single-page statement confirming that I had reviewed the documents. I signed it with a hand that didn't tremble. I felt like I was watching someone else do it. My name, written so many times across those pages, didn't look like mine. It looked like a decision, a verdict. He offered to walk me through the process of accessing the funds, managing the trust, consolidating accounts if I wished. I nodded. I would follow up, I said, but not today. I needed time. He understood. I placed the papers carefully back into the folder, tucked the folder into my coat, and stood. Back in the parking lot, the sun had risen fully, washing the pavement in pale gold. I sat in the car for a long time, the engine off, folder on my lap. I ran my hand over the cover. Smooth. Thick. It didn't feel like money. It felt like a shield, like she had put something between me and the world she didn't trust. Something that now sat quietly in my hands. That was the silence of the bank, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something unspoken, something solid, something final. And as I turned the key in the ignition, I knew. This chapter of my life was no longer about survival. It was about choosing what to do with the quiet she left me. I had always known Mary to be a meticulous woman. She never threw away a receipt, never misplaced a bill, never once forgot a birthday. Her handwriting, careful and fluid, filled notebooks and calendars and recipe cards in our kitchen drawers. I found comfort in her order, even if I didn't always understand it. But I never expected that, after her death, she would continue to speak through ink and folded paper. It began with the smallest discovery. I had gone into the attic that morning to pull down the last of the Christmas boxes. There was something comforting about packing it all away myself. No rush, no noise, just me and the hum of old insulation. As I opened the worn cardboard labeled Xmas Living Room, I noticed something wedged in the corner that hadn't been there before. A small wooden box, no bigger than a loaf of bread, its surface scratched with time and use. Inside were letters. Not just a few, but dozens, all written in Mary's hand, all addressed to me. They weren't labeled by date, only by titles she had chosen herself. Some had single words: winter, faith, David. Others had phrases: when you need strength, or if I go first. My heart skipped reading that one. I held it in my hands for a long time before I opened it. She had written that letter nearly 8 years ago. In it, she told me about the way she had been feeling after her second health scare, and how it had shifted something inside her. Not fear, not sorrow, but clarity. She wrote about wanting to protect me in ways I hadn't thought I needed, about how she began making plans, not out of distrust, but out of love. She knew David had grown distant, colder since his marriage. She saw things I hadn't let myself see. In her neat, looping script, she had laid out the reasons behind every decision she made: the accounts, the trust, the will, the envelope. I read that letter 3 times. Each word folded into me like something familiar, but long forgotten. It wasn't just her voice, it was her presence, her thoughts, ordered and intentional, filling the silence I had carried since the funeral. One by one, I read more of the letters. Some were memories, stories of our early years, our first house, the time the basement flooded on Thanksgiving. She reminded me of moments I had half forgotten, names I hadn't spoken in decades. Some letters were more recent, detailing her observations about the family, her quiet heartbreaks, and her unwavering belief in kindness even when the world failed to offer it back. There were letters about David, too, painful ones. She had tried, again and again, to connect with him. Birthday cards unanswered, invitations ignored, voicemails left hanging in the air. She never wrote a bad word about him, but she didn't sugarcoat her disappointment. She had wanted a son who saw her, not just a woman who raised him, and she feared he would do the same to me. But there was one letter that struck deeper than all the others. It was titled, simply, Last Christmas. In it, she described the plan she had made months before her death. She had known somehow that she wouldn't make it to another Christmas. Her health had declined quickly, and though she hadn't let on, she had felt the slipping. She had set aside the recipe cards for the meal I ended up cooking alone. She had hidden the envelope in a file marked property insurance in the cabinet drawer. She had written the note David and Melissa would eventually send me, the one they passed off as a joke, and she had guessed exactly how it would land. She had written all of it, and then, at the bottom, in her clean, quiet hand, she added one last line. Don't be angry. Use this. Use it how you wish, but don't let them shape what's left of your story. I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest. The attic was cold and dim, dust swirling in thin light from the window. I sat on the floor, surrounded by her handwriting, and felt something shift in me. Not anger, not grief. Something like resolve, like alignment. She had known me better than I knew myself. By the time I climbed back down, I carried more than a box of old letters. I carried a map, a quiet guide through the fog of days that had blurred together since she left. It was strange, in a way. All my life, I had believed that love lived in the spoken word, in the promises we made, the laughter we shared. But now I saw it more clearly. Her love lived in preparation, in the quiet arrangements, in the careful words she left behind. That night, I placed the letters in a clean file folder and tucked them into the lockbox. Not to be forgotten, but to be remembered, slowly, as I needed them. They were not instructions. They were not warnings. They were just reminders. Reminders that I had not been left alone, that someone had thought ahead for me, even when I hadn't known to ask. That love, real love, leaves a trail of pages behind. I never expected to hear the doorbell again that week. The house had gone still after Christmas Day, as if the absence of family had frozen everything in place. The lights on the porch still blinked gently through the evenings, but inside, silence had settled, like snow. I had stopped checking my phone. I had stopped expecting anything at all. So when the chime echoed through the hall the next morning, I thought it might have been a glitch. Or maybe the wind. It wasn't. I walked slowly to the door. My knees had stiffened overnight, and my fingers ached from the cold. I opened it, half expecting to find no one. But there, on my porch, stood someone I hadn't seen in years. He was bundled in a long coat, a wool cap pulled over his graying hair, and a paper bag in one hand. At first I didn't recognize him. Time does that. Rearranges faces, dulls the edges, shifts the memory. But then he smiled. That small, tired smile that hadn't changed since college. His name was Leonard. We used to teach together at the high school back in the 70s. He had moved away long before Mary passed. I hadn't heard from him in nearly a decade. He didn't speak, and neither did I. I just stepped back and let him in. I didn't ask how he knew to come. I didn't ask if someone had told him, or if he had felt it in that strange, invisible way that old friends sometimes do. He hung his coat, placed the bag on the counter, and sat at the table, as though no years had passed at all. There was something deeply human about that kind of presence. No explanations, no apologies for the time lost. Just arrival. Quiet, honest arrival. He unpacked the bag slowly, a half loaf of rye bread, a jar of pickled onions, a small container of stew, still warm, and 2 oranges, bright against the winter light. He laid everything out with care, as if setting a table for something sacred. And maybe it was. Maybe that was the sacredness. 2 old men eating in a quiet kitchen, pretending for an hour that the world hadn't changed as much as it had. I watched the way he buttered the bread, the way he ate slowly, nodding to himself between bites. And I realized how long it had been since I had been in the company of someone who expected nothing from me. No performance, no explanation, just being. We didn't say a word. And yet, in that silence, something opened. I poured 2 cups of black coffee. I pushed the small tin of sugar toward him. He didn't take it. Never had. I remembered that. One of the few things my mind still held clearly. After we finished eating, he stood and moved to the living room. I followed. He stopped in front of the tree, still lit, its ornaments catching the mid-morning sun. He looked at it for a long while, his hands in his pockets. Then he sat in Mary's chair, the one she had always curled into by the window. It didn't feel like a violation. It felt like tribute. I sat opposite him. Time stretched. I thought of Mary. I thought of the letters. I thought of the envelope. All the weight of that week hovered between us, unspoken but understood. And then he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small wrapped box. It was square, plain, wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. No tag, no name, just the quiet weight of it. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a wooden carving of a bird, a sparrow. Hand-carved, simple, sanded smooth. On the bottom, burned into the wood, were 2 initials. MC, Mary's initials. I looked up at him. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just looked at me, and I understood. Years ago, Mary had taken a wood-carving class with Leonard. It was during one of her long summers, when she wanted to try something new. I had forgotten all about it. She had made a few small animals, most of which ended up in donation boxes or the hands of grandchildren. But this bird, this sparrow, I had never seen. He had kept it all those years. I set it down gently on the windowsill beside her chair. And then I leaned back. We sat there for hours, saying nothing. Eventually, the sun began to lower, and Leonard stood. He put on his coat, nodded once toward the tree, and walked to the door. I followed him out to the porch, where the snow had just begun to fall again. He looked up at the sky for a moment, then turned back toward me and patted my shoulder. That was all. Then he walked down the steps and disappeared down the street. I stood there until he was out of sight. The sparrow caught the light behind me through the window. That night, I didn't turn off the Christmas lights. I let them shine until morning, not because I expected anyone to see them, but because something inside me felt different, not repaired, not healed, but opened. Like the air had shifted, a guest had come, not the one I had hoped for, but perhaps the one I had needed. It happened on a Tuesday. The snow had started to melt just enough to make the roads slushy and loud under tires. I had spent the morning sorting through a drawer of batteries and old keys, not looking for anything in particular, just moving my hands to quiet my mind. The air in the house still carried the scent of pine, though the tree had begun to droop, its needles falling like whispers. Outside, the mailbox door clinked in the wind. I was not expecting anyone. But then I saw the car, David's gray SUV with the dented fender, pulling up the drive like it always had, casually, like nothing had changed. I stood still, halfway between the kitchen and the hallway, as the engine clicked off and the silence deepened. A moment later, I heard the doors open, then slam, then two sets of footsteps, lighter ones, careful on the salted concrete. Melissa's boots, probably, then his. They didn't knock. They used the key. The lock turned, and the door opened slowly, not like a guest, but like someone who believes they still belong. I remained in place. They entered with the scent of cold air and department store perfume. Their coats were unbuttoned, cheeks red from the wind. David carried a bag from the grocery store, like that somehow made this normal. Melissa held a folded jacket in her arms and glanced around the living room with a practiced, shallow kind of smile. Their movements were cautious, but not regretful. Calculated, like people stepping into a space they believed would receive them out of habit. David called my name once, not loud, but with that tone that suggested he assumed I'd be glad. I wasn't. I stayed silent. They made their way into the kitchen. I heard the bag rustle, a cabinet open, water running. Then silence. I still hadn't moved. The house didn't welcome them. It didn't push them out either. It just waited. After a few minutes, I walked to the kitchen doorway and stood there. They both looked up, surprised by my stillness. I think they expected warmth, or at least routine. Instead, they saw something they hadn't seen before. I looked at them, really looked at them, and realized how much space had grown between us. Not the kind that comes with miles or time. The kind that comes with choices. Melissa smiled first, small and cautious. David adjusted his collar like he wanted to speak. Neither did. I moved past them and poured myself a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. I didn't offer them any. I didn't need to. They weren't here to be guests. They were here because something had shifted, and they didn't know what yet. But they sensed it. We all sat, eventually, around the table. I didn't light the candle like I had on Christmas. I let the gray light from the window fall over us, dull and honest. David pulled an envelope from his jacket. This time, it wasn't empty. It was thick, filled with papers and clippings and printed contracts. He placed it on the table and slid it toward me like an offering. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I already knew. It was the house. They had assumed it would be theirs, naturally. The paperwork was likely drawn up months ago, perhaps even before Mary had passed, maybe while she was still alive, and just sick enough that she couldn't fight it. I had always wondered how far ahead they had planned, but I had moved ahead, too. They didn't know about the transfer. They didn't know about the separation of assets. They didn't know that the bank accounts were no longer joint and that the title had quietly been rewritten. They didn't know that the home they thought would pass through generations was no longer in play. I had moved it, just like I had moved the future. I sipped my coffee. The envelope remained untouched. Melissa crossed her arms. David's leg bounced under the table. The silence began to stretch, but I didn't rescue them from it. I had done that too many times before. I let it expand, let it press against the corners of the room like a cold front settling in. Finally, they stood. I didn't rise with them. David took the envelope back, holding it tighter than he had before. They didn't make excuses. They didn't apologize. They didn't demand. They just left. Quietly. But this time, with a kind of uncertainty I hadn't seen in them before. They had returned expecting the past to wait for them, but the past had packed up and gone. I watched through the window as they reached the car. The engine took a moment to turn over. Melissa glanced back once, briefly. Then they were gone. I stood there long after the tail lights had disappeared. Then I picked up the envelope from the table. I didn't open it. I burned it in the fireplace. The day after they left, the house was still as it had been, but it felt lighter, like something heavy had been peeled from the walls and set outside. I walked from room to room in my slippers, tracing the outlines of picture frames with my finger, not to clean them, but just to remember what they had once held. Most of the photographs were gone, not from malice or theft, but from quiet decisions I had made in the weeks after Mary passed. Some I had stored in boxes, some I had burned, not out of anger, out of clarity. For years I had told myself that family meant endurance, that you stay and you forgive, and you wait because blood demands patience. But patience, I had come to learn, is not the same as peace. And peace was something I hadn't had in years, not since Mary had started fading, not since David stopped looking at me as a man and started seeing me only as a vault with a heartbeat. I opened the front door and stepped outside. The snow had crusted over from the overnight frost, and the wind had turned sharp again. The world looked new, but I knew better. A cold world doesn't forget what warmth once felt like. It simply stops asking for it. I walked to the mailbox. Nothing. Just air. For a moment I thought of putting something inside. Maybe the receipt for the envelope they had given me on Christmas. Maybe the leftover wrapping paper still stuffed in the kitchen drawer. But I didn't. That would have required more energy than the memory deserved. Inside, the answering machine's red light blinked. I pressed the button. Static. Then silence. Then the automated voice telling me there were no new messages. I stood there, listening to the confirmation of nothing. And I realized something. The absence of words could be more generous than the presence of them. For so long, I had waited for explanations, for apologies, for that one perfect sentence that would pull the past back together. But now, standing in a quiet house, I understood the futility of waiting for people to say what they were never going to say. Words, when they do not come freely, are rarely worth hearing. So I turned off the machine, unplugged it, wrapped the cord around its body, and placed it in the same drawer where I kept old screws, unused keys, and dead remotes. That was where it belonged, with the things that once had a purpose but no longer did. I sat at the table after that and took out a pen. I had promised myself I wouldn't write anything, but my hands had different ideas. Not letters, not even journal entries, just fragments. I wrote down Mary's laugh. Not a description of it, just the sound as I remembered it. I wrote down the creak of the floorboard near the bedroom door, the color of the mug she used for tea, the way the morning light used to hit her side of the bed in winter. None of it meant anything to anyone else. But it wasn't for anyone else. It was my way of preserving the only language that hadn't disappointed me: memory. By afternoon, I started to pack. Not for a trip, not in haste, just a quiet sorting of what I'd keep and what I'd leave. I folded the good towels, placed 2 sets of sheets in a box, pulled the old leather suitcase from the top shelf of the closet. It still smelled faintly of cedar. I opened it and lined the bottom with sweaters, not because I needed them all, but because it felt wrong to leave them behind. Every item I touched, I asked a silent question. Was it mine, or was it theirs? Not legally, not practically, but emotionally. Had it belonged to the life I lived before, or the one I was finally ready to begin? Most of the answers were simple. A few weren't, but even those I made peace with. There was no need for notes, no dramatic letters, no final words taped to the mirror. If they ever came back, they wouldn't find a manifesto. They wouldn't find instructions, just space. Because the words that mattered had already been spoken between us long ago, in glances and silences and avoidances. And those words, those ghosts, did not need repeating. That evening, I lit a fire in the hearth, not for warmth. The house wasn't cold, but for ritual. I sat by it with a mug of coffee and the sound of logs shifting, crackling. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't play music. The quiet was full enough. I thought about what I might say to David if he called again. Then I stopped. Not out of anger, out of mercy. Because there are truths too heavy to place in another's hands, and because some lessons are meant to be learned in silence. The fire burned low. I finished my coffee, and I said nothing at all. The morning after the fire died down, I opened the windows. It was January, and the air was sharp enough to sting the skin, but I let it in anyway. The cold rushed through the house like a reckoning. It moved through the curtains, curled around the legs of the furniture, lifted the corners of old rugs. I stood in the center of the living room and let it pass through me too. For weeks, I had existed in something between memory and performance. I had tried to make Christmas feel real. I had cooked. I had cleaned. I had dressed as though someone might come to see me. But the theater had closed, the actors had gone home, and all that remained was the bare stage of my life. I did not cry, not out of pride. I simply had nothing left that needed to be spilled. Everything I had wanted to say had been swallowed by time, absorbed into quiet gestures, folded into the pages of letters I never sent, and rooms I never left. Silence had become my only honest language. But even silence can become too loud when left alone too long. So I began to move. Not frantically, not with purpose even, just with a kind of rhythm, like a man who walks not to arrive anywhere, but to remember what his legs are for. I started in the attic, the place Mary had always wanted to organize, but never had the chance. The boxes there were covered in a skin of dust thick enough to feel like cloth. I opened them one by one. Old records, holiday decorations, cards from birthdays long forgotten. In one corner, I found a small cedar chest I had forgotten we even owned. Inside it were little things, spools of ribbon, silver buttons, notes written in her hand. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. The weight of her was there in the ink, in the careful fold of each scrap, in the scent that still clung to paper not meant to last this long. I took the chest downstairs and placed it on the table, not as a shrine, but as a reminder. She had been real. We had been real, and that reality did not need validation from a child too distracted to remember the stories that had built the ground beneath his feet. Later that afternoon, I made tea. I drank it from her mug, the one with the small chip on the handle that never quite cut your finger, but always reminded you it was there. I wrapped myself in the cardigan she used to wear in the evenings and sat on the porch despite the cold. I watched the street, the bare trees, the slight movement of clouds. I thought of the man I had been before marriage, before fatherhood, before grief became my shadow. I was quieter now, slower, but not lesser, not gone. I still had a pulse, and that pulse was mine, not inherited, not borrowed, not owed to anyone. It was mine. I made a list that evening, not resolutions, not goals, just truths. 1, I am still here. 2, I owe no explanations. 3, I do not need permission to be happy. 4, my love does not require repayment. 5, peace is earned, not gifted. I folded the list and placed it in the cedar chest beside her things. Let it live there, next to memories that had teeth but no longer bit. That night I didn't turn on any lights. I let the dark settle over the house like a blanket, let my body find its own rhythm in the blackness. I walked slowly, touching the walls with my hands, learning the home again as if for the first time. Each creak in the floor became a note in a forgotten song. Each breath I took felt like reclaiming a word from a language I had once known, but abandoned. I slept on the couch, not out of sadness, but because the living room held the memory of her laughter. It echoed less now, but sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, I thought I could hear it again, like the tail end of a song played from a passing car. In the morning, I shaved. I trimmed my nails. I polished my shoes. I folded my clothes instead of letting them sit in a heap. I was not preparing for anything. I was not expecting anyone. But I wanted to meet myself in the mirror with dignity. The man looking back at me was older. Yes, weathered. But there was a spark behind his eyes I hadn't seen in months, maybe longer. He looked like someone who had stopped asking for answers and had started making peace with questions that would never be resolved. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt whole in a way that surprised me. As if by letting go of the roles others had written for me, I had finally stumbled upon the script I was meant to live. When I stepped outside again that day, it was still winter, still bitter. But the cold no longer felt like punishment. It felt like something clean, like truth. And for the first time in a long time, I walked without looking back. The snow came earlier than expected. The forecast had promised a light dusting, just enough to make the rooftops sparkle. But when I woke that morning, the world outside had disappeared under a thick, soundless blanket. The road, the mailbox, even the tops of the fence posts were gone beneath it, as if the world had exhaled overnight and left only softness behind. I stood at the window for a long time, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold before I remembered to drink it. Everything was still, the kind of stillness that doesn't ask questions, doesn't offer answers. It just is. A kind of silence I hadn't known in years. Not the silence of abandonment or distance, but the kind that wraps around you and lets you breathe. That morning, I didn't rush into the day. I didn't dress quickly or make plans. I simply sat. I watched the slow descent of flakes still tumbling from the sky, steady and unbothered by gravity. I felt no pressure to be anywhere, to say anything, to prove my usefulness. It was, in a strange way, my first true day of retirement, not from work, but from expectation, from the need to show up in the roles others had written for me. I was no longer a husband, a father, a host, or an ornament to someone else's holiday. I was simply me, a man, in a house with a snow-covered yard and a morning full of nothing. By noon, I had shoveled a small path from the front door to the porch, not because I was expecting guests, but because I wanted to feel the weight of the snow in my hands. I wanted the ache in my back and the rhythm of moving something that was mine to move. The scrape of the shovel against the concrete reminded me I still had force, still had choice, still had body. Later that day, I found myself pulling out a puzzle Mary and I had never finished. 1,000 pieces, most of them sky. I laid them out across the dining table and spent the afternoon matching blues, not rushing, not solving, just letting my fingers find their way through color and memory. It was the kind of slow task that invited thought, but didn't demand it. In the background, I played one of her favorite records. The crackle between songs reminded me of the way she used to hum when she cooked. I hadn't realized how much I missed the incidental sounds of her breath, her footsteps, the way she tapped the side of a pot with a wooden spoon. They had vanished so gradually that I didn't notice they were gone until silence became their replacement. As evening came, I lit a fire in the hearth. I didn't need the heat. The house was warm enough. But the flicker of flame, the scent of smoke, the slow collapse of logs into ash, it all made me feel like something was alive again, even if it was just the room. I sat in my chair with a blanket over my knees, watching the flames dance. The puzzle lay unfinished beside me, and I felt no urgency to complete it. There was a time, not long ago, when I would have filled this kind of day with tasks. I would have cleaned the gutters, reorganized the shed, written a list of phone calls to make. But I didn't need distraction anymore. I wasn't afraid of the quiet. That night, I stepped out onto the porch once more. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky had cleared. The moon cast a glow over everything, turning the landscape into something silver and hushed. I walked out into the yard, past the bird bath, past the sleeping garden, and stood in the middle of it all, breath clouding in front of me. I looked up at the stars, the way I used to as a boy, when winter meant sledding and hot chocolate and frost-bitten fingers. There was a strange comfort in knowing those same stars still hung above me, that in the grand turning of the world, I was still here, changed, but not erased. I thought of David and Melissa, wherever they were. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance, like watching a ship disappear over the horizon. It wasn't my responsibility to chase them. I had sent my message, even if they didn't understand it. And now, the sea between us would widen on its own, without force, without blame. I returned inside and boiled water for tea. I used the mug Mary had bought at a roadside shop years ago, the one with the crooked handle. It fit perfectly in my hand. I sat at the table, looked at the unfinished puzzle, and picked up a single piece. I held it in my palm for a while before placing it in a spot I wasn't certain was correct. That was the thing about grief, I realized. It wasn't a wound that healed in a straight line. It was a series of quiet guesses, of days spent trying to fit yourself into the world again, not knowing if the edges matched or if the picture would ever come clear. I finished my tea, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Outside, the snow glowed faintly in the moonlight. Inside, the fire burned low, but steady. And in the hush of the unplanned winter, I finally felt the shape of my own life returning, not in triumph, but in truth. I knew when I sealed it that it wasn't just paper inside. It was everything I hadn't said for the past few years, every silence I had endured, every glance they didn't return, every invitation they never sent. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of grief and clarity had made the ink denser, the paper thicker. I placed it on the hall table by the front door, under the brass key bowl Mary once chose for its leaf-shaped rim. Then I waited. The snow had begun to melt around the edges of the house. Icicles loosened one by one, falling with soft thuds into the shrubs below. There was something symbolic in that, the thawing, the slow release. The outside world was waking again, returning from the stillness of winter. I had no idea if they would come back, but the door remained unlocked. The envelope remained in place. On the third day of the new year, they arrived. I heard the car before I saw it, the low, impatient hum of an engine that didn't want to idle in cold, the crunch of tires over slush. I stood in the kitchen and let the sound come to me without moving. I didn't check the mirror. I didn't fix my collar. I didn't pretend to brew coffee I wouldn't offer. I let the moment exist exactly as it was. This was no reunion. It was closure. They didn't knock at first. Perhaps they were expecting the door to open on its own. When it didn't, I heard hesitant steps, and then the door creaked, the same way it always had. I listened to them shuffle inside, boots scuffing the mat, coats rustling, the stiffness of people unsure of how to stand in a place they once considered theirs. And then a pause. I imagined them seeing it, the envelope, white, square, plain, no decoration, just one word written in my hand. Yours. I didn't step out to greet them. I didn't rise from my chair. Instead, I remained in the room Mary had painted yellow for its sunlight. I sat in the very chair where I'd once read Christmas cards aloud, long before they had become silent. Minutes passed. I knew they were reading. Inside the envelope were 2 sheets of paper. The first was a letter. Not sentimental, not angry, just honest. It said I had updated my will, that the house was no longer part of the estate, that it had been legally transferred to a trust in Mary's name, and that upon my passing, the property would be donated to a local foundation for elderly caregivers, those who, like her, had spent years giving more than they received. It said that all financial ties between us were now dissolved. There would be no inheritance, no disputes, no more guessing. The second paper was a copy of the original deed to a small cabin in Vermont, my real home now, bought quietly with the money they thought had disappeared. The cabin's photo was clipped to the corner, snow-covered roof, a wood stove chimney, a dock frozen into the lake. My handwriting below read, "Where I'll be." I didn't write a farewell. I didn't ask for understanding. I left only facts and a forwarding address, an invitation, not a plea. They stayed in the house for perhaps 5 minutes. I never heard them speak. Only the sound of footsteps retreating, the door closing more softly than it had opened. The car backed down the driveway, paused once, then drove away. I waited an hour before walking back into the hall. The envelope was gone. The brass bowl was still there, untouched, and the sunlight coming through the sidelights was warmer than I remembered it being all month. I felt no triumph, no vindication, just peace. That night, I packed a single bag. I took only what I needed: the worn photograph of Mary in her garden hat, my copy of Thoreau's journal, 2 flannel shirts, and the key to the cabin. I didn't leave a note. I didn't set an alarm. I simply locked the door behind me and slid the key into the mailbox, just in case they ever came back and needed shelter again. The drive north was slow. I didn't rush. I stopped at small diners. I watched the fields pass by, empty and frozen. The world felt bigger than it had in years. When I arrived at the cabin, the lake was still solid. I stepped out into the cold and listened. No traffic, no phones, just the creak of trees and the far-off call of a bird I couldn't name. Inside, I built a fire. The walls smelled of cedar and smoke. The bed was made, the shelves still dusty from my last visit. I opened the window to let in the winter air and stood by it, breathing in the new year. No decorations, no expectations, just me and the quiet. And I realized, not for the first time, that sometimes the greatest gift isn't what's inside the envelope, but what you choose to send with it.